I'm excited to join you all here. I'm sorry I can't be there in person. I'm currently based in Montana, but so it would have been a bit of a trip. But I did spend about 10 years in California, so I do miss it there. But today I'm going to be talking about some of the work I did for my PhD. And this work was the basis of one of my chapters for my PhD, and I've continued to work on it for the past few years after I graduated. And I'll talk a little bit more about sort of how we're continuing to work on it. But I'm going to be talking about tracking avian dispersal and movement using drones and drone-based telemetry. So a little bit about me. I did my undergraduate education in Minnesota at a small school called Carleton College. Right after college, I moved out to California and I started my PhD at the University of California, Davis a few years after I moved out. I completed that PhD in 2021. I did a small postdoc at UC Davis, and then I moved to Montana just this last summer. And I'm currently a postdoc at the University of Montana. So for my PhD, I studied birds, and that's what we're going to be talking about today. In Montana, I'm actually studying white-tailed deer. A lot of my PhD was statistical and mathematical work, which we're not going to get into today, I promise. But that sort of mathematical background allowed me to transfer my skills to different species. So it's been really fun to learn about different wildlife species besides birds, because my whole PhD was focused on birds, which are cool, but I'm an ecologist, so I like other kinds of ecology too. So all of my field work and all of the work I'm going to be sharing with you all today takes place in the Great Basin. And the Great Basin, this is a photograph of the Great Basin, is the largest internally draining watershed in North America. It has over 300 mountain ranges, and these are pretty decent sized mountain ranges. They range from about 1,600 to 3,200 meters. And the Great Basin is a cold desert. And that means that the majority of the precipitation that does fall in this desert ecosystem falls as snow. So all of the water, the majority of the water that's coming in during the summer and the spring months is from snowmelt instead of storms. So that's what makes it sort of this arid, dry climate. And it's really defined by a sagebrush ecosystem. My lab group, my PI in graduate school was Dr. Erica Fleischman. She's now currently at Oregon State, but Erica and her group have been collecting data on birds in the Great Basin since 2001. I joined their crew in 2016, and I spent 7 field seasons in the Great Basin, 7 summers, collecting data on birds, and sort of other things related to birds, like bird food and bird habitat quality. So this is a map of the outline of the Great Basin, and those black dots are all of the sites that we go out and survey every summer. Each one of those dots represents a canyon in a mountain range. And so each one of those dots represents about 12 points that we go out and conduct point counts at to survey for birds. So it's a pretty big field season. We are smack dab in the middle of Nevada, literally the middle of nowhere. And then we do have some really beautiful sites on the east slope of the Sierra Nevada as well. That's sort of my favorite place to be. So a little bit more about my fieldwork. I just wanted to show you some pretty pictures. My fieldwork consisted of heading out at the very beginning of the bird breeding season. So sort of in the 20s of May is when we would go out. I would camp all summer, either alone or with a partner, with a field partner. And every morning we would survey for birds in these mountain canyons. So we would start at either the lowest or the highest elevation, and we would walk or drive up the canyon conducting point counts. And point counts And you might know this, but they are a really common technique we use to survey for birds. Basically, it consists of standing in one sort of predefined location. And for some defined amount of time, we did 8-minute point counts. You write down every single bird you detect, either by sound or by sight. And you repeat that same process in the same location 3 times during a breeding season. And doing it 3 times allows us to calculate things like detection probability, which is really important when we want to try to understand the size or the density of a population. So these are some cool pictures of my fieldwork in the Great Basin. In addition to point counts, I also collected data on microclimate. So that's this weird white thing on a pole. That's actually a little sensor in there that's collecting data on climate, on temperature and precipitation at a really fine scale. This is kind of what the output looks like. I also collected data on bird food, so insect biomass and plant seed and fruit production. And I'll talk a little bit about those today. Okay, so that's sort of the introduction to my fieldwork in the Great Basin. And now I sort of want to introduce this problem that I thought a lot about during my dissertation, and now am continuing to think about as I move through my scientific career. And that's this idea of how do birds, and really how do animals, respond to environmental change? And there are 3 main ways that we know animals respond. The first one is to evolve. And this evolution, of course, requires some sort of genetic change, something that can be passed down to the next generation. But evolution is really difficult in the face of climate change because it moves so much slower than climate change is happening. Animals can also adapt. And by adapt, I mean adjusting behaviors or physical traits they already have to the environment to improve their chances of survival. This is something we see relatively often. And then sort of the response that I'm most interested in is animals can move, right? Animals can move out of a really hot area into a cooler area, right? These can be really fine scale movements, like just moving into a shady spot, or these can be really large scale movements. And a really large scale movement that we know that's going on is animals moving north in latitude. And so across the globe, there is a well-known latitudinal gradient in temperature, right? The poles, or the northern hemisphere, is a lot cooler than the southern hemisphere. As we move up in latitude, we're getting cooler temperatures. And there seems to be evidence that animals are moving, not just birds, but all kinds of animals are moving north in latitude to try to escape climate change, to try to find their climactic envelope that they're really happy in. Maybe that's shifted, 2 degrees latitude. It seems like animals might be moving. And so this is a paper that came out. This was looking at distributional shifts north in latitude. This paper came out in 2011 in Science. It looked at over 750 different kinds of species, and it compared the expected latitudinal shifts, that's what we're seeing on the x-axis, to the observed, to what we actually saw, the observed latitudinal shifts. All those different dots are different kinds of animals. So for example, open circles are birds, solid circles are arthropods, a triangle is a plant. So they looked at all kinds of animals. And basically what they found, if the dots are in this blue shaded area, that means that the latitudinal shifts were larger than we would expect. And if they're in this portion of the graph, that means that those latitudinal shifts are actually less than we would expect. But sort of what I want you to take from this is that a lot of these animals are actually moving. Although they might be moving less or more than we expect, there does seem to be an overall trend in distributional shifts north in latitude. So this is a really large scale way that animals can move. A change in latitude is a really big deal for most animals. Maybe not so much for birds because they can fly. But the shift that I was really interested in is a much finer scale shift, and that's an elevational shift. So Similar to a temperature gradient globally, latitudinally, we also have this elevational gradient in temperature. This is something its scientific name is the adiabatic lapse rate. This is the idea that as we move up in elevation, we're getting cooler, right? You've probably experienced this on a hike. At a low elevations, maybe at the beginning of your hike, it's nice and warm. And as you hike up a mountain, it's getting cooler and cooler. And by the end of the hike, you're taking your jacket out of your backpack and you're putting it on. And what's kind of cool about elevational gradients is that in a really small amount of space, we can have a really big change in temperature. And that makes them a really cool natural laboratory to study how animals respond to temperature changes. So for example, just a 500 meter, oh, there's my little bird, a 500 meter shift upslope in elevation is equivalent to moving 450 kilometers north in latitude. So that's the distance from Sonora to Mount Shasta. That distance in latitude, an animal can get that same temperature change by just moving 500 meters up in elevation, which is cool. So I was really interested in this. I wondered if there was evidence that this was happening. And luckily, this science paper in 2011 showed that similar to latitudinal shifts, it does seem that a lot of animals are moving upslope in elevation. As you can see, the majority of those movements are a lot less than we would expect, though, which is kind of interesting. And I'm not going to get into why that might be today, but I'm happy to talk about that at the end if somebody wants to. So these elevational shifts that were examined in this paper were all sort of long-term, over decades, elevational shifts. But when I was in the field, I was noticing that it seemed that birds were shifting in elevation just during the time I was in the field, just during the summer, the breeding season. And so my question was, are birds shifting in elevation through the breeding season? And what could be going on there? Because we don't have a lot of hypotheses about why birds would move in the breeding season. In fact, a pretty well-known paradigm in ornithology is that birds migrate, at least in the northern hemisphere, right? Birds migrate to their breeding territories. They might move around a little bit at the beginning of the breeding season, looking for a nest site, scoping out territories. They find their territory, they sort of set up their territory, and they hang out there the whole breeding season. Then they, move at the end to molt or to migrate back. So there's this paradigm of static territories. But when I was in the field, I was seeing behavioral changes. I would see some birds at low elevations when I first went out in the field, and then they would disappear, and I would hike up the mountain. I would find them at higher elevations. And I was really curious about what was going on. So moving within a breeding season is not a totally new idea, right? We do know that there are types of dispersal or movement that occur within the breeding season. So this figure on, I think you're right, is a little confusing to look at. This is a life cycle of a green-tailed towhee, one of the birds that I study. And so to sort of orientate you, the center circle is the lightest blue is when green-tailed towhees are molting. The next color blue is when they're breeding. And the darkest blue, the most outer ring of the circle, is when they're in migration. And those black lines define when that life event is happening throughout the year. And each sort of slice of the pie represents a different month. And so breeding season is sort of down here in May, June, and July. And we know that there's a lot of movement that happens in this red triangle. So we have post-fledgling dispersal here, right? We have baby birds that are leaving their nests, getting away from their parents, scoping out their own territories for the next year. We also have adults that have finished breeding. And once an adult is done breeding, often they move from their territory. They might do something called molt migration, where they migrate to a new location to molt, maybe one that has more food or less predators, or they just might move to sort of a central location and group up together to get ready for migration. So we know that there's all this movement that occurs right at the end of the breeding season. But when I was in the field, I was observing movement that was occurring during this blue triangle. And that's not movement that should be attributed to post-fledgling dispersal or post-breeding dispersal. And specifically, this was movement of adults. We don't collect any data on juveniles, so this is just adult birds. So I'm calling this within season dispersal, and I think it's happening. And so I sort of went out to try to prove that this was going on. And I think there are a couple reasons why this might be happening. The first reason could be changing competition. If the abundance of different individuals around you changes, maybe a competitor either increases or decreases in abundance, you might move to avoid that competition, or you might move to take advantage of newly open territories. I also think something that could potentially be going on is birds that have either failed nest and then are trying to nest again, or a second nest might move into new open territory. And I also think there's a lot of shifting resources going on, and that birds are taking advantage of these changing resources. And I think an example of what I mean by shifting resources is really well illustrated in this picture. So these are some photos I took from one of our field sites in 2017. This is, if you've ever driven down 395 and you've driven past Mono Lake, you have driven past this field site. This is just maybe 5 miles north of Mono Lake on 395. But I think comparing these two photos from a bird's eye view really illustrates how resources can change, not only over an elevational gradient, but through time in a single breeding season. And so in this first picture, this is not great bird habitat, right? Especially if you're a ground or a shrub nesting bird, there's no ground or shrubs for you to nest in. The water's frozen over, there's 4 feet of snow, there's no insects, there's no plant growth. But just 26 days later, which, incidentally is about the time it takes to fledge a bird, this is great bird habitat, right? We've got open ground, we've got a lot of insects, a lot of flowering and seeding plants, we've got really good nesting habitat. So my question was, are birds taking advantage of these changes in fine scale resources and moving upslope within a single breeding season to take advantage of newly open territory? I sort of had this idea that this might be what's going on. And the other sort of piece of this is, I think if we can identify bird species that are able to track these fine scale changes in habitat over a really short time scale, that might give us a clue about what kind of species are going to do a good job adapting to climate change into the future. And it might tell us what species might not do a good job. And those might be the species that we need to go in and do more management actions for and help them out. So I did a lot of math and a lot of statistics on a lot of data. And I'm not going to talk about that because it's boring, but this is sort of the results. At the end of the day, what I found is that, yes, indeed, there were some species that were displaying upslope movement. And in one instance, there was downslope movement, and that was a green-tailed towhee. And so I looked at a total of 25 species that we had a lot of data for. And these are the species that displayed that movement. I think there's potentially even more species in the Great Basin that are moving within the breeding season, but the mathematical models were really tricky here, and it's actually something I'm still working on getting just right. So this is awesome. This was a really cool result. And it sort of proved to me that there was evidence for population level elevational dispersal. But it doesn't really tell us anything about what's going on with an individual bird, like who is actually moving. Are birds moving after a failed nest? is sort of this movement trend we're seeing. Is it just late arriving second-year birds that are forced into lower quality habitat, forced into that really snowy habitat at the beginning of the season? Maybe we are just capturing adults that finish breeding early and are moving up slope. It's really hard to know what's going on. All I have evidence for is this population level trend. I can't say anything about exactly who's moving. In order to do that, I need to observe individual birds and see what they're doing over a breeding season. But observing individual birds is really hard, right? Keeping track of a same bird for multiple months, like how do you do that? So my idea was to use telemetry. And so telemetry in avian ecology has been around for a long time. You've probably heard of like collars on deer or large animals that might monitor their movements through GPS. Transmitter technology actually started tracking through radio signals using something called VHF, or very high frequency transmitters. And these have been around for a long time. And VHF transmitters come in all shapes and sizes, depending on the animal you want to put them on. But luckily, they're getting smaller and smaller now. So we are able to attach them to really small animals like birds. Unfortunately, GPS technology does not exist right now that is small enough to put on something like a Lajelai bunting, which is a bird we're interested in tracking. So right now we're stuck with radio transmitters. And there are a couple different methods you can use once you have a little transmitter on an animal. There are a couple methods you can use to track that animal. The most traditional is something called a Yagi antenna. This is a directional handheld receiver. This is actually sort of an old school one. You now can have a little app on your phone that interacts with the antenna. But basically what you're doing is you're wearing headphones and you're carrying your antenna around in the field, and it's big and it's bulky, and you're holding it over your head, and you're listening to beeps in the headphones that are telling you how close the animal is to you. A more recent advancement in telemetry technology is something called MODIS wildlife tracking stations. These are passive collecting stations. So it's basically a permanent big antenna you mount in the field. You can see there's a solar panel on there that keeps it charged. And what's really cool about MODIS stations is that they will collect data from any transmitter that is within 2.5 kilometers of the station. And then that data is uploaded to a public database. And so if I tagged a bird, say in Sacramento, and my bird flew all the way to Wisconsin and there was a MODIS wildlife tower there, I would be able to pick up that bird. So that's pretty cool. Unfortunately, the majority of the MODIS towers are in the eastern United States. My field sites are right here in the middle of Nevada, where there are approximately 0 MODIS towers. So this was really not useful for our research. We could have purchased our own MODIS tower, but we were really concerned that, first of all, it would be vandalized because we have a lot of recreational folks coming into our sites. And second, that it wouldn't be able to pick up any transmitter tags because we have these really rocky, steep canyons that we work in. I'm actually going to show a video. So this is actually one of my field sites that we do a lot of our equipment testing in. This is in the center of Nevada. This is a drone flight that I did. You can actually see we're coming up on camp. You can see a few cars under trees right here. But as you can see, this is a pretty tight canyon. And so even if we were able to put a passive tracking tower like a MODIS tower up in here, it would probably, the signals would get bounced around due to the rock formations. We'd also probably need to put more like 4 or 5 towers. We just didn't have the budget for that, and we weren't sure it was going to work. So what I came up instead is to use drones. And so drones and adding a telemetry system onto a drone is a really new application of how to track birds in the field. It hasn't been used very much. The system I'm going to talk about today has been completely invented from the bottom up by myself and my collaborators. So this isn't something you can go out and buy. This is something we're building ourselves. And we've been field testing this equipment for the past 2 summers. This is going to be our 3rd summer field testing. And hopefully we will have sort of our final model this summer, is sort of what we're hoping to do. So I wanted to kind of walk you through what it's like to track a bird with a drone, and just sort of show you some cool field pictures I've taken over the past few years. But the first thing that we do is we capture our target species in a mist net. I'm sure you all know what a mist net is, but it's a pretty fine mesh net that we use to capture birds. Here, we're really interested in the species that I identified as moving in my mathematical models. So green-tailed towhees are a big bird we're trying to catch, lazuli buntings. So we have to have birds that are heavy enough to hold a tag. So like our warblers are unfortunately too small. We don't have tags small enough for the warblers, but we use playbacks to sort of attract birds into our nets, and then we detangle them. Here's me detangling a angry little lazuli bunting. And then we're going to attach a transmitter onto them using a backpack harness. Our transmitters are really tiny. They're either solar or battery powered. And we actually have been finding that our solar tags work best, which is surprising. I thought they were going to lose all their juice when a bird was hanging out in the underbrush or the shade, but it seems like they do actually a really good job transmitting even from shady areas. And these transmitters are super tiny. They're just 5% of a bird's body weight. And all they're doing is they're pinging out a signal every 5 seconds. They're just pinging out a little radio signal. So we captured the bird, we do some other morphological measurements on it, and we attach the transmitter. This is myself and my colleague, Dr. Luke George, attaching transmitters to that poor lazuli that's getting tortured. This is an incredibly finicky, difficult process. We got a lot better at it as time went on, but I really feel bad for that maybe first and second bird that we tagged. They were in the hand for about 10 minutes, which was not very nice. So once we have the transmitters on, we release the birds, let them go about their lives. The transmitters should not affect them. They're just 5% of their body weight, and they're difficult to get to. The birds can't really reach around and pull them off. So the next thing we do is we try to track these birds with a drone. So the drone, we didn't build the drone, but we did build this little computer that's sitting on top of the drone. So this is a really simple computer. It's just a receiver that's trying to receive those radio signals from the birds. And this is an antenna coming off the back of the drone. And you can see it here as well in flight. And that's what's listening for the pings. And in addition to the receiver on the drone, we also have a receiver that is sort of sitting next to me, plugged into a computer on the ground. This is actually our sort of version 1, where we had a big giant receiver that we had to carry around. We no longer do that. We have a tiny, about 6-inch antenna that plugs into our computer screen. So it's actually really easy to hike and backpack with all this equipment. We wanted it to be able to all fit in a backpack so we could hike from location to location with all of our equipment. And so what we do is we fly pre-programmed flights across the area we're interested in. So we're flying usually about a 4 to 8 kilometer canyon. And that means we need to fly multiple flights because a drone battery, unfortunately, only lasts about 30 minutes. So what we do is we pre-program these flights where every time we're flying this route, we are flying at the same speed, we're flying at the same altitude, we're stopping at the same for the same amount of time at points. And this is really important to sort of control for differences in detectability of these birds. So you can imagine if we flew one flight at 400 meters and we flew the next flight at 100 meters, we might have some differences in the signal strength of our birds. And so we really need to control for this. And this is just an app. It's called Litchi app. It's a great app for those of you who are familiar with drone flights, if you're interested in sort of flying repeated paths. And then what's cool about this is we can analyze the data we get right there in the field. We just sort of need a laptop and then a way to charge the laptop, which is a little generator that we drive around in our trucks with. And basically what we do is we've constructed a little algorithm that takes the strength of the signal that the drone receives and the strength of the signal that my computer receives, which is sitting right next to me. It uses that difference in strength of signal to triangulate an approximate location of the bird. And so this is an example of what a result might look like. This is our beautiful picture of one of our tagged lazuli. You can see the antenna coming off his back. This was taken by one of our field techs. I just think it's such a great picture. And this is the result. This is sort of what I was working on sitting there in the field on the computer. These dots are every time the drone picked up a transmission from the bird. The greener the dot, the stronger the signal. The redder the dot, the weaker the signal. And that black dot is the actual location of the bird. So basically we flew this flight, and then I had my techs go out, and I didn't let my techs look at this data. I just said, go find that male lazuli that's tagged blue-yellow. Go find him, tell me where he is. Took them about 10 minutes, they found him, but what was really cool is our algorithm got within 50 meters of the real location of that bird. And so these birds are moving, kilometers in elevation. And so, being able to see a 50-meter change in elevation potentially is really cool and really exciting. And our technology is continuing to improve every year. We get better and better. We're testing it more and more. We're working with our engineers to sort of build a better computer and build better transmitters. And I'm really excited to see where this technology goes. We're hoping to have this project funded through a large NSF grant within the next year. So we'll see. Grants are hard to get. But kind of the next things that I'm thinking of is sort of why are these birds moving? If we can see an individual is moving, that's great, but can we understand why they're moving? And so some things that I would really like to test is this idea of shifting food phenology, so shifting availability of food, or shifting nest site phenology, shifting availability of nesting materials and availability of nest sites. I think competition would be awesome to look at. And I also wonder if movement is age class specific. So I wonder if it's only first year birds or maybe only second year birds that are moving. Is it that these older, more mature adults don't have to move territories? Maybe they can hold down a really good territory while younger adults are unable to get a really good territory right at the beginning of the breeding season. So they sort of need to wait until something else opens up. And I'm also really interested in thinking about at what elevation is reproduction the highest, right? There should be some elevation or some temperature where birds do the very best job reproducing. And I wonder if we can correlate that to elevation and say something about climate change and how the environment is changing over time. And if that's going to impact reproduction, which of course has huge impacts on population growth and population persistence. So briefly like to thank all of the sort of folks that funded me and all the programs I was a part of for this research, but that was all I had for you today, and I am happy to take any kind of questions.
Well, Martha, that was really impressive. Thank you very much. And I'm amazed at what the technology can do these days. So does anybody here have any questions? Well, let me start off. Well, let me comment first. I'm amazed at the state of the technology, but I was wondering how many, you taught earlier at the beginning about expectations. How do you generate expectations? You showed the graphs where the results were above or below the expectations, but I wondered where the original expectations came from.
Yeah, so I think those came from a very simple, something we called a climate envelope model. So if we know where the bird's range is, normally, we can say, okay, if the temperature changes by 1 degree Celsius, if it moves up by 1 degree Celsius, that whole range should shift up in latitude to approximate that 1 degree shift. So those expected shifts, I didn't write that paper, and I haven't read it in a year or two, but I'm pretty sure they just used simple climate envelope models to predict what that range shift would look like if nothing else was going on. And, there's a million things going on, right? Temperature is just one piece of how a bird decides its habitat.
Yeah. How many birds would you have to use per species to get data that you think is really valid? I mean, 1 or 2 wouldn't do it. That would be individuals. But when you talk about a population, how many do you have to catch in your mist net to do the job, get a good understanding?
Yeah, that's a really good question. We're hoping that we can catch at least 20 individuals of each species we're interested in every year, and hopefully we can do it for a few years. And we're potentially hoping to combine that data with point count data in a single sort of statistical model, which would give us a lot more power to say what was going on. But you're right, sample size is definitely an issue in any study where you're looking at like behavior, where you have to look at individuals.
Yeah, how many years do you think the project needs to last to give you definitive data?
I think if we could get 5 years of funding, that would be awesome.
Yeah. Okay. Anybody else got a question? This is a really complex subject, of course, isn't it?
I know. It was sort of a PhD defense talk. So yeah, I put a lot in there.
Do you track the same birds or year after year, or as long as they survive? But is that the idea, or does the transmitter die after a while? I suppose it does, actually.
Well, if it's a solar powered transmitter, it shouldn't die.
Right.
As of yet, so last year was the first year we really got a good amount of transmitters out. We got 17 transmitters out. So it will be really interesting going back this year to see if some of those birds return, and we'll be looking for them.
Yeah, that'll be interesting, wouldn't it? I noticed you said the green-tailed towhee was the one that went downslope. That, I suppose after 1 year, you couldn't be sure that really is what's going to happen. I mean, there could be an aberration for 1 year, I suppose, with a small sample size.
Yeah, that downslope movement came from quite a few years of data. That came from 18 years of data. That was the point count population stuff. Yeah, the downslope movement is really interesting, and people have been really interested in that, and why that might be going on. I think potentially what could be happening is that there are resources at lower elevations that green-tailed towhees are interested in. They're fine with nesting and feeding in really arid, dry sagebrush. And so it might be that there are these more riparian obligate species that are moving up and taking a lot of territory, and green-tailed towhees are like, well, that's okay, I'll move down. There's lots of delicious sagebrush downslope that nobody's hanging out in. So it could be a competition thing. It could also just not be going on, right? We could be wrong. And that's what we're hoping tracking individuals will tell us.
Right. You mentioned at the beginning, you're talking about evolution, adaptation, and physical movement. And you mentioned an adaptation about behavioral adaptation. You weren't talking about genetic adaptation there, or were you? I asked you that because I'm reading a lot about this for the moment, and I'm having difficulty understanding exactly the distinction between evolution and adaptation. I'm trying to understand that. So I'm just wondering what you're thinking of when you talk about that.
Yeah, that's a really good question. So I guess when I talk about evolution, I'm more talking about these longer scale changes that you can pass on to your offspring, and they can pass on to your offspring, right? Sort of more classical evolution. While adaptation is could be more, maybe that would just take place in one generation. For example, this is something we often see in like fish, where fish that are living in really like hypoxic or anoxic conditions, their offspring just in one generation, and it's not really like a gene mutation, it's more like genes that were already there just get turned on in the next generation, are able to better survive in these conditions. So it's kind of like mini evolution, but we didn't need to create any new genes. They're already there. They just might be turned off because they're not in use.
I get it. Is there any likely correlation between size and the amount of displacement, the amount of distance that they go? I mean, is there a weight contribution, do you think?
You mean in terms of the elevational movement?
Yes, that's what I mean, because the larger the body, then, as you know, it's got more heat relative to area, so it's got a different dynamic in the thermally. And I wondered if that might have an impact, or if it's possible to measure that, or if you're thinking about that.
Yeah, that's really interesting. There's actually a paper that just maybe came out 7 or 8 months ago out of a UCLA lab that really examined exactly what you're talking about, where they looked at weight, they looked at like wing length, I believe, and dispersal movement. So both latitudinal and elevational movement. And I know that they found correlations with body shape and movement. I can't remember exactly what their conclusions were, but you're definitely onto something. Yeah, there are definitely some correlations there.
You're working exclusively with passerines right now, I suppose, are you?
Yes. So we did see that the hummingbird, the broadtail hummingbird moved, but we do not have the permits to capture hummingbirds. They are very difficult to, you need sort of a specialized person who knows exactly what they're doing. I don't want to touch a hummingbird. I'd squish it. So.
Right. Yeah. Well, okay. So Ralph, you want to come up and ask a question? Ralph is our programs director. In fact, he's the guy who first talked to you. So you can see him face to face this time.
Am I there?
Yes. Stand back a little bit.
Yeah.
You can stand back. All right.
There, I can,
yeah, you're in good shape now.
So does anybody know how long these little birds live? And how a changing lifespan it would seem to me if they had a really short lifespan of just a season or two, that it might make your work more difficult.
Yeah, so these birds only live 2 or 3 years, maybe 4 years. These passerines don't live very long. So I'm more interested in understanding how they move just within one season. So it'd be awesome if I got to see them multiple years in a row. That'd be really cool. But that's sort of not what we're expecting to happen. We're expecting to sort of be able to track these birds for one season and then kind of never see them again. Either they die, they don't come back to the same place, their transmitter drops off. But yeah, these are pretty short-lived little animals. So.
Any other questions? Oh, Tom's got one? Yeah. Tom is our past president and soon to be new president.
Replacement for Barry. About right. My question was, during the time of your research, was the Great Basin in a drought condition, and that might have affected the migration of the birds just because of the drought and availability of food?
Yeah, that's a really good question. The data that we use to look at movement of these birds, so not the drone stuff, the other point count data, that was collected from 2001 to 2019. So we sort of span the gamut. In drought years, we had really high water years. And I basically, in my mathematical model, I controlled for year. So I made sure that any differences between years that we didn't measure were accounted for in the model so that they weren't affecting our results. So that's that part of the question. I think you're definitely right that we are going to see differences in movement depending on what kind of weather is going on. For example, this year, I mean, I think things are going to be really weird this year. We're going to have a huge amount of water in what is usually a really dry ecosystem. And so how these birds are going to respond, I'm just not sure. It may be that they're moving more. It may be that they're moving less, right? Maybe everything's going to be really green and there's going to be lots of bugs and lots of fruit no matter where you go. So there's no need to move. It also might be if there's snowpack at high elevations that sticks around the whole breeding season, we're going to have birds compressed into lower elevations. So this is going to be a really interesting year for bird work in the Sierras and into Nevada.
Yeah, it really is going to be a fascinating year, isn't it? I'm sure you're going to have some hypotheses at the end of the year too when you see the data.
I have one more question.
Ralph's got one more question.
Is there a way of identifying each one of your little sensors that's on the bird? Like if one came back in a month or two, or even the next year, would you be able to tell us what individual that was?
Yes. So each tag transmits a unique radio signal. So we have it recorded which bird is going to which tag. So if we ever see that unique radio signal again, we'll know what bird it's from.
Quite amazing, isn't it? Quite amazing. Does anybody online have a question? And if so, you'd have to unmute yourself. Doesn't look like it. All right. Well, Martha, it's been a pleasure to listen to this now. I've been absolutely fascinated with what you've been talking about, and I hope we'll get a chance to see your results at some point in time. Isn't it the case that in your world you have to publish? So
Yes.
the question is, how can we get a hold of your data when you've pulled it together? Will there be a paper at some point in time, and how will we know about that?
Yes, there definitely will be hopefully multiple papers. I have a paper that just came out on not this research, but looking at birds in the Great Basin, looking at how they use habitat differently across space. So anybody can read that, or it's actually annoyingly behind a paywall. So if you want to read it, please email me and I will send it to you for free. Do not pay for it.
Okay, I'd appreciate that.
And then I have another one hopefully coming out soon that has to do with longer term elevational movement. So elevation movement that's been occurring on a decades long time scale and not this short time scale we talked about today.
No. Well, in 10 years' time, if I'm still around, I'll communicate with you. How's that?
Sounds good.
But that's a doubtful proposition, as a matter of fact. Anyway, Martha, it's been an absolute pleasure. Really appreciate you being with us tonight. So thank you very much indeed.
Yeah, thank you so much. This was a lot of fun.